to understand, because on the one hand, I thought that we were having this very intense and beautiful connection, right? Like you had this very rare, like physical, intimacy that I think really gave you some kind of power, I guess. Like you felt like you became like a new person by experiencing all these intimate relations, but also it's quite difficult to me for me to understand until today why she eventually she abandoned me and she just kind of like broke up with me.
Relationships are hard enough already when you're a teenager, not to mention when you can't talk about it because what you've done is considered taboo. I remember when I was 15 and I had a crush on someone, I couldn't even tell my best friend about it, not to mention getting into an actual relationship. And now imagine you're Dewi. You're figuring out your sexuality. You're lying to your father about your religion. Now you're queer on top of it, and then you've been broken up with. I thought about how confusing this must have been for Dewi, and I wondered how she handled it.
I mean, I couldn't sleep for like weeks, and then I started cutting myself again, and it was just a very depressing, dark, period. And of course, I didn't know how to deal with it. Like I didn't know what to deal with. There was a part of me at the time that also felt that it was my fault for having participated in this forbidden, like sinful relationship. And therefore, like I also felt like I had to like fix myself, that I had to sort of rectify, my sexuality. And so that sort of depressive period went on for like half a year or so. And then a year later, I started a relationship with a guy whom I also had like some, not really sexual intercourse, but like sexual relations, with. And I could do it because, as it turns out, I'm a bisexual. So I also like men. And at the time, having this new boyfriend kind of helped. It sort of distracted me from what I was facing beforehand, and it fulfilled that sexual desire or need for intimacy that I had longed for. But at the same time, I remember telling my boyfriend about this experience that I had with Lydia, and he couldn't really accept it. I mean, he accepted it, and he didn't harass me, or he didn't say anything, violent or bad. But at the same time, I remember he said something like if you wanted to masturbate, if you want to touch yourself, like please don't think about like lesbian sex, like please don't think about like what happened to you with Lydia. Like if you want to think about you with other men, like that's fine, like you could do anything you want, but please don't think about lesbian love or relationship. But of course, it didn't stop me from fantasizing about women. Like it could not stop me. I just became better at lying, like to him, right? Uh, eventually my relationship with him ended, but until now, I still feel I haven't really dealt with that breakup that I faced 10 years ago with Lydia. People might think that it sounded like such a petty thing that you experienced when you were a teenager, but for some reason, like to me, it just still felt like I keep wondering how our lives could have been if the world were different, if we did not have to sneak around and lie or feel ashamed or guilty about our sexuality and desires and things like that. And I don't know, I still feel sad that I never really got to talk about it with Lydia, like what the hell happened and
Considering how hard family life was and the added tumultuous feelings from the breakup with Lydia, Dewi explained that a departure from Indonesia was inevitable.
One of the main reasons I wanted to go abroad so badly was because I wanted to get away from my parents.
She went to the Netherlands to start university, but upon arriving, she found that the freedom she experienced there also came with its own kind of challenges.
Yeah, but it was also liberating in so many ways. For one thing, I was finally away from my parents, which meant that I had all this freedom, I was like, hey, I could finally, do whatever I want. Like, it was just kind of like this feeling of like I had been like sheltered for all my life, but it was this sense of freedom of like speech. and expression, I guess, to a certain extent, obviously, because, there are also certain norms in the Netherlands that you have to comply with, but they're just different, right? But I guess what I meant with freedom of speech and expression is that, in contrast with my previous life in Jakarta, when I went to the Netherlands, I finally felt like people around me were not necessarily like pretending to be someone else, not pretending to keep like peace and harmony all the time. Like there's no sense of trying to appease the other person and just to try to avoid confrontation or conflict.
Let's take a moment to reflect on Indonesia's colonial history, assisted by Wikipedia. Indonesia is an archipelagic country of 17,000 islands and a strategic position for inter-island and international trade. Starting in the 16th century, waves of Europeans, the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British, sought to dominate the so-called Spice Islands of Indonesia. But it was the Dutch who ultimately had more influence, and for a much longer period of time. The Dutch controlled Indonesia's trade and therefore its wealth from 1602 until 1949. That's 347 years of influence. These years included a system of indentured labor, similar to plantations in the United States, as well as violence from the Dutch police and military in maintaining control over the Indonesian archipelago. Only this year, in March 2020, did the Dutch king Willem-Alexander formally apologize for the violence inflicted by the Dutch upon Indonesia during its colonial presence and during Indonesia's war for independence.
In line with earlier statements by my government, I would like to express and repeat regret and apologies for the excessive violence on the part of the Dutch in those years. And I do so in the full realization that the pain and sorrow of the families affected continue to be felt today.
I mean, I'm not saying that in Indonesia we're still like super mad about Dutch colonialism or something like that. But of course, like, as for me personally, as an Indonesian, having lived in the Netherlands, for example, when I experienced certain kinds of discrimination or certain kinds of exclusion, for example, like from the job market or from any like welfare, assistance or things like that, then I would feel quite indignant, right? Like I would feel that like, what the fuck, man? Like it's just so unfair. And of course it's not only affecting me, it's not only negatively affecting me. And I guess what makes me more angry is that actually there are more people in the world that are living such more difficult lives than I am. And
I noticed that Dewi frequently did something I see a lot of people with trauma do: refer to how other people have it worse, implying that the pain and suffering that we've experienced is less or doesn't deserve to be heard. It makes me wonder if minimizing our own problems by using the suffering of others as a reference point makes any sense. Won't there always be someone out there whose life is harder than yours? Does that make your suffering less valid and theirs more? And if pain and suffering is subjective and relative, how can we talk about it in a constructive way that both honors our lived experiences as well as maintaining perspective on the collective human experience? Let's do a recap. After a tumultuous end to a forbidden relationship with Lydia, Dewi left Indonesia to study in the Netherlands. Her initial foray into the much freer society was liberating, but at the same time she encountered different kinds of challenges. For one, she was constantly obstructed by Dutch bureaucracy regarding her right to stay and work in the Netherlands. Despite the fact that Dewi had studied in the Netherlands and was married to a Dutchman, she continued to be blocked by red tape that prevented her and her husband from being able to settle down. We'll get to this in a bit. For now, my conversation with Dewi took a different turn. Because we can't talk about the Netherlands without talking about cannabis. So we were talking about, the things that you found surprising or that stood out to you in your time in the Netherlands. What else was particularly memorable to you during that time, but whether, positive or negative?
One thing that I thought about right away was the possibility of trying out different kinds of drugs, which I think has very much influenced like my development as a person, because as many people know, in the Netherlands, you have cannabis coffee shops, right? Yeah, where you could buy small amounts of cannabis, and this whole industry is kind of like in a gray area, but is tolerated. It's a very like typical Dutch approach.
For many in the Netherlands, whether you're a tourist or a resident, cannabis culture is one of the biggest attractions. Currently, only 2 countries in the world have legalized the recreational use of cannabis, Uruguay and Canada. Despite falling into a legal gray zone, the cannabis industry in the Netherlands is estimated at nearly 5 billion euros per year. Globally, the cannabis industry is projected to be worth $74 billion by 2027. Many seek out cannabis for its relaxing and mild analgesic effects. Depending on the strain, it can also be sought for its creativity-enhancing and perspective-altering effects. For Dewi, it was that and a whole lot more.
Like before I came to the Netherlands, I had never thought about it. I had never really been interested in trying out drugs, and it was also quite a surprise for me, like to discover that opportunity and to actually seize it. So I started, trying out cannabis, and it turned out wonderful, and I could finally relax, like I could finally sleep properly, and I could finally also go through some of the psychological challenges that I faced and the trauma that I experienced as a child, and also kind of to help me like get over my religious trauma as somebody who grew up with Catholicism, what was very extreme Catholicism. In terms of other drugs, as a consumer, it's also easier to do it in the Netherlands because like the law like does not punish people for consuming it. And it's just relatively safer because of this environment. Like you just feel safer to try different things and to actually learn that like this whole drug prohibition shit is just nonsense, right?
And on top of that, when a society is not restrictive in the use of these substances and you don't get punished for it, then there can also be open discourse about it. And then you can build a community around it and ask questions and do your research about it. And so it's not like, if you're going to do it under a very strict setting and you have to keep it to yourself, that if something happens, or you take the wrong dose or you have a bad experience, that you're left to yourself to deal with it. Whereas, in a society where things are more open, you have the chance to learn from your peers. You have the chance to ask questions to several different people and inform yourself before you do something.
Yeah, and also to kind of be able to prevent like the harms that might happen, right? That might occur when you take drugs. And I think the same logic applies to like sex, right? And I guess that's also why like the phenomenon like unwanted pregnancies like in the Netherlands so much lower than in other countries. And exactly. I think this sense of community that you get from being able to share information and to exchange ideas and to just ask questions openly and to share opinions more comfortably is that you become more not only well informed, but you become more confident in the choices that you make, right? You feel empowered of having the access to all the different kinds of information and all the different kinds of opinions as well that you're allowed to think about and that you're allowed to hear and you're allowed to express at the same time.
How did that change you as a person? You did say that you became more confident in your choices. What else happened as a result of being able to experiment with different substances?
I think after 10 months of living in the Netherlands, of studying in The Hague, I felt more comfortable just expressing myself, just voicing my opinions and all that. And I thought it would be a good idea to tell my mother about my atheism and the fact that I've been having sex and like spending the night at a boyfriend's house and things like that. So I did. So I had a Skype call with my mother and I told her that, okay, I'm having sex with somebody and staying at his place, and and also like I no longer go to church. And
your mother must have had the worst day of her life.
I know.
On that day.
Oh my God, yeah, I know. It was quite like I just like went like straight on, and I can imagine that it was quite like an intense like couple of hours for both.
But you also trusted her with that information. You trusted that she would be able to handle it, which is something that I think is very commendable on your side.
Yeah, I mean, I trusted her, but she did not handle it well, in fact, So I told her about all this, and she asked me, like, so you just don't believe in God then? And, like, what do you believe in then? And I just tried to explain it to her, that all the, scientific facts that I had heard and I had learned about, and why I feel that way. And after that, she just, like, we ended the call, but since that point, like, she never really raised that issue again. Like, she just started pretending that it never